there's a certain degree of anxiety that comes with a remake or an adaptation of a beloved old franchise. While sometimes the new works can be just as good if not better than the original, just as often it can go against what made the previous one great, and I usually feel that many things are just better left alone. The original 1995 feature version of Ghost in the Shell is one of my favorite films, animated or not. There's just something about the world, the direction, the pacing, the structure, the themes, the music, and just general atmosphere that really draws me in, and I grow fonder of it every time I see it. Though I never really got into anything else in the franchise outside of the Yoshi films, I can't really point to any of the other installments and say they look outright bad. So then if you're anything like me, then your reaction upon hearing of the live-action version of Ghost in the Shell was probably something along the lines of yeah, these sort of things don't really tend to work out, do they? Now, in all honesty, out of all the really big-name anime works to adapt, Ghost in the Shell is probably one of the more feasible. Unlike something like that ill-fated Akira film, there is no real story concepts that can't be decently replicated in live action, and the scale as a whole is a lot more manageable. You could film it in Hong Kong, dress a couple sets up with a rusty mechanical vibe, make sure to have a smoke machine handy, and save the budget for the big set pieces like the hacker chase or the tank battle. Of course, it won't be this, and it'll be a CGI piece of shit shot against a million green screens, but in principle, it could be done alright. This all depends on how loose of an adaptation it is. Whether it's going to ape the plot beat for beat, or just borrow some elements of it, whether the setting's going to be changed to America, with American characters and American values, or if it's just going to be Scarlett Johansson running around Japan for no reason. Really, so little is known about it, and it's still so far away that I don't see any reason for me to get worked up over it. I'm not optimistic about it in the slightest, but it's still a year and a half away, which is just way too much time to be stewing in the collective vitriol about how bad it's going to be. Though I have to admit, it does get my goat a little bit when I see comments like this. Well, I mean, like, it's not like I necessarily disagree with him or anything like that. It's just, how did you get almost every title inaccurate? That's impressive. I mean, it's just, like, Titan Falls. What the fuck? But I'm not here to talk about the live-action version today, because that's pretty much all I have to say about it. Instead, this video will be talking about the 2008 re-release / update of the original film, Ghost in the Shell 2.0, which features some visual and audio edits. As you can probably gather from my nitpicky fanboy tone, I think these changes are for the worse. And while most of them are fairly minor, they do a fair amount of damage, and one change in particular is enough to nearly ruin the entire film. So somewhere along the line, Mamoru Oshii fell in love with 3D animation. Most of his films of the 2000s feature some sort of blend of 2D and 3D animation, which for the most part works pretty well. Though I have to recommend looking up some of the CG in his live-action film Avalon. It's something else. He seems so fond of this style that with this re-release, he and his team have recreated several scenes and shots using 3D, but unfortunately with disastrous results. Now, it's not just that I think the animation looks like shit. I mean, I do think it looks like shit. It looks like a PS2 era animation student's first year project, but the biggest problem is that it does not cut together well with the rest of the cell animation. There are a few reasons for this. First of all, there's some pretty big differences in shot and direction styles. Like a majority of 2D animation, Ghost in the Shell consists mostly of locked-off shots and simple pans, while 2.0 has big sweeping camera movements that rotate jarringly in 3D space. While the model of the Major isn't necessarily that bad, it's made a lot worse because of the lighting. The soft gradient shading sticks out sharply with the regular two-tone shading of the cell animation, made all the worse by the lack of any line art on her model. There's no real distinction or logic as to what gets the 3D treatment or not. The shots are either completely 3D, or a single model is planted sharply against a 2D background. Its overall use is also infrequent as hell. It's practically every second shot or scene in the first 20 minutes of the movie, but then it peters off for the rest of the film, only showing up as some vehicles or wide shots of the city. Then there are problems with the frame rate. Again, like most 2D animation, Ghost in the Shell is largely animated on 2s and 3s, meaning that a single image is held for 2 or 3 frames, depending on the motion, while the 3D in 2.0 is rendered at a full 24 FPS, which can make certain actions and motions look weird and floaty when compared to the original. This is an inherent problem with mixing the animations after the fact. You obviously can't boost the frame rate of the already completed 2D animation, and lowering the frame rate of the 3D animation would only make things look worse. Not only that, but the 3D is rendered with a moderate amount of motion blur, while the traditional animation obviously has none. And finally, there is just the overall different look and feel between something shot on a film camera and something digitally rendered, and they don't at all look like they belong in the same space. Now that incredibly long and pedantic list may have made me seem like a militant anti-3D traditional animation snob, but I'm not against the mixing of 2D and 3D on principle. Sometimes the mixing of the mediums can be used to create an interesting visual style, and for this you have to look no further than Ghost in the Shell's own sequel, Innocence. Almost every complaint I just listed about 2.0 is avoided in this film. There's much more consistent and motivated use of complicated camera movement, which allows you to get used to the style. There's a very clear design choice in what gets what animation, with the characters being 2D and the backgrounds being 3D. The characters all being 2D means that the problems with lighting and shading are mostly avoided. Almost every shot in the film contains a consistent blend of 2D and 3D, with one really never overpowering the other. The 2D animation for moving shots are mostly done on 1s or 2s, which helps bridge the frame rate difference closer, with more complicated shots tending to have slight adjustments on the double-up frames to bring it even further. And finally, the 2D animation all uses digital ink and paint, meaning that there is far less contrast between the image color and the spatial quality. It does have a couple of dud moments of gaudy-looking 3D here and there, but on the whole, Innocence is a great-looking film, and it's because they were able to design and plan the whole movie around the blending of the two mediums. It wasn't just taking a film you made 13 years ago and replacing random bits with your new fancy and shiny technology. It's just so baffling to me as to why they would make this change. To me, this is the equivalent of taking a 90s television show shot in 4:3, and then every third shot is just replaced with 16:9 HD footage of the same actors 20 years older. Maybe it was Oshii trying to retroactively match the style of the sequel, maybe he was trying to incorrectly invoke the Uncanny Valley, or hell, maybe the teamy advert was just shit. But I'm left with the frightening possibility that the man who directed Angel's Egg thinks that this looks good. While the 3D is the biggest and most glaring visual change, it's not the only one, and the rest are just as damaging to the film. There is widespread color correction and filters throughout, presumably to either clean up the footage or to match the color scheme that comes with the new 3D animation. While half the time it's fine and unnoticeable, there are many scenes in which the color feels degraded, either by feeling too washed out or being inappropriately colored for the scene. The place where this most stands out is in the cityscapes at night, which in the original had cold blues, greens, and purples, but was swapped out for a bleeding orange in 2.0. This color scheme isn't necessarily bad on its own, but I think it's in conflict with the mood of the film. Those original colors makes the city feel clinical and damp, and it creates this really strong classic cyberpunk vibe. While orange is much closer to what real life light pollution looks like, I feel this just serves to make it feel more dull, as well as sharply contrast with the scenes that have a mostly unchanged color palette. This orangey glow is also applied to pretty much every holograph in the film, which themselves have been completely redone. Now these new displays actually look pretty good, and the 3D blends well, both because of the simpler geometry and the in-story nature of them, but I still think this is an unnecessary change. The blocky green projections of the original might look ugly and dated, but they are part of the film's heritage. Their aesthetic represents a time and a place, and its speculative vision of the future, and while I can understand the desire to change this due to the benefits of hindsight, to do so is to take away some of the film's charm and texture. The final visual change is a couple of moments where certain shots or snippets have been removed or altered. These are so incredibly minor and few that you probably wouldn't even pick up on them unless you had some sort of snobbish conservative agenda against the film, but again, they're to its detriment. Take this scene. In the first one, we see the Major look back at the woman, then a shot of the woman from her point of view, and then a shot of the brain scan monitor, while the new one we go straight from the Major to the screen. Such an incredibly pedantic nitpick, yes, but the first sequence is just a lot more clearer. While the new one, you could easily read this as being the Major's brain scan monitor, and with the new sound effect and visual style, it's a lot less clear that it even is a brain scan monitor and not just some really weird visual representation of her brain for absolutely no reason. Again, these moments aren't very often and are very minor, but they just stick out to me like a sore thumb, and not just because I've seen the movie a million times. So that was most of the visual changes, but don't worry, now you get to listen to me complain about the audio changes. Most of these are more subtle than the visual ones, but they are far more prevalent, to the point that it's almost an entirely new audio track. Thankfully, the music is pretty much untouched. It's remastered and remixed slightly, but in terms of placement and usage, it's virtually the same. This means that my favorite scene, which is the scenery montage, which has the least of the visual edits, is pretty much perfectly preserved, which is one concession that I'll give the film. So in regards to the sound effects, many of them have been remixed or replaced entirely, and in general there just seems to be a lot more noise. Now it's arguable that the new sounds are technically better, both in terms of recording quality and content, but I still feel that they are missing something. Most of the 2.0 stuff sounds cleaner and more realistic when compared to the old. The original of this doesn't sound like a footstep at all. But the originals have a unique charm to them that the new ones lack. Again, it's part of the film's heritage, and they contribute more than you think to its overall vibe, and there is something about that dorky anime footstep or explosion foley that has more of an effect on me. Also, a lot of the new sounds feel comparatively dull. This is predominantly seen in the machine and weapon foley. The new sounds are deeper and bassy, yet they somehow feel peppery and less impactful, lacking the ferocity and weight of the first mix. Along with a lot of the new sound effects, a lot of the dialogue has been re-recorded as well. Now I always feel a little weird critiquing voice acting in anime, mainly because as someone who doesn't speak the language, there would be countless nuances that just go over my head, so I honestly don't notice that much of a difference here. Sure, there are a few moments where I can tell that it's a new recording, but these moments that I do notice are so minor to not really be that noteworthy. You could argue that the cold, tired detachment inherent in the original recordings is better at conveying the themes of transhumanism and loss of humanity and being a cog caught in a bureaucratized machine more than the airy, flighty recordings of the new ones, but that's getting into super fanboy nitpicky territory than I already am, and it's not like I really give that much of a shit if there's a slightly different reading of the way she complains about menstrual cramps. But the final voice acting difference, and the most obvious change in the film aside from the 3D, is the changing of the puppet master's voice from male to female. Now, it's not that I think the gender of an AI is important. In fact, I prefer to think that it doesn't even have a gender, but I think an enormous amount of the effect is lost.
私は情報の海で発生した生命体だ。私は情報の海で発生した生命体だ。
This dainty and delicate body with an expressionless stare and deep booming male voice was such an unsettling combination, and without it, the character is a much less creepy and menacing villain. And while the new actress isn't doing a bad job, it feels a lot less fresh, especially since it feels like she's trying hard to match the original intonations, rather than trying to find her own groove. Again, it baffles me as to why the team felt this was a necessary change. Like maybe they thought the puppet body would have a fixed female voice box and the AI shouldn't be able to switch it to a male one, but then that makes no sense because when it switches bodies with the major, they switch voices anyway. And unfortunately, the only other conclusion that I could come up with is that Oshii thought it was hotter. This video may have seemed a bit extreme, considering that a lot of the complaining was about slightly cleaner sound effects and them changing a color. It's not as if Ghost in the Shell 2.0 is the worst re-release ever made. Compared to some other special edition updates, it might not even seem that drastic. And at the very least, the old version is still readily available, but just the idea that the film needs updating rubs me the wrong way. I'm sure that whatever potential changes a live-action film could make will be 1,000 times more blasphemous than anything in 2.0, but at the least that will be its own product. All the alterations may seem small enough as to not be anything that bad, but they compound on each other, to the point that though it's the exact same story, it's a much worse film. There are some decent changes. Some of the new drony soundscape noises are pretty cool, and the end chant theme is back in after it was replaced in a lot of the previous releases, but these aren't at all worth the price of admission. And when all of the change elements are working in tandem, it may be a lot more subjective as to whether it's bad, but I know which version I prefer. I can understand the feeling of looking back on something you made years ago and having the desire to go back and change all the things you now think are awful, but I think that after a certain point in time that you should just let it be, and that time had long since passed for Ghost in the Shell. All these attempts to update it don't hide the fact that it's a film made 2 decades ago, which isn't a thing that should be hidden in the first place. I think it benefits from the aesthetic of that era. And ironically, 7 years later, all the updated gimmicks in 2.0 make it feel more dated than the original film ever did. Anyway, let's just hope that when the live-action film comes out and I inevitably go see it because I'm a masochist, that I don't have to sit next to this guy. I mean, just like, seriously, goddamn, this, have you seen any of those films? I don't even know what I'm looking at here. I mean, this is... Do you think that the main character's name is in Ghost in the Shell is Ghost in the Shell? Just off the scale and from life and every plebby child, I can't know what to do. I feel violated by this man from life and every get on my knees. I'm just gonna do Jesus. Get on my knees. Jesus.